I'd like to welcome to the stage our panelists here. My name is Louis Shepard. I'm the Vice Chair of the AFCEA Intelligence Committee and also an INSA member, and so we're very happy to have this session. A couple of logistical notes. I'd like to thank today's breakout session room sponsor, CACI. I know there are several CACI people here. Wanted to make sure to thank them for that. All of our corporate sponsors are great. And also, right after this session, there'll be a network and exhibits break out in the Potomac Ballroom front area. So you can look forward to that. At the end of this scintillating conversation, you're going to have questions, I think, for these panelists. The questions, we're going to be using note cards. You still have the note cards probably that you got when you registered. We have some more available. So feel free to, we have a couple of interns roaming the room who'll be collecting them, pass them down the aisle to the end of, down your row to the end of the aisle. And they'll be collected if you raise your hand. I believe that's all the logistical stuff. We have until 11:30, so let's get started. I love the title of this. I came up with the title of this, so of course I love it. Welcome to our panel discussion, the Tortoise and the Hare, Federal Government Emerging Technology and Government Acquisition. Today we'll explore efforts across the national security enterprise to ensure the U.S. government's faster and more agile than our adversaries in acquiring capabilities to provide an over-the-horizon strategic advantage. Our current adversaries, I'm going to edit this, sometimes benefit from the fact that they don't have to abide by the same legal, economic, or ethical rules as the U.S. To make matters more challenging, we are faced with an environment where our adversaries are achieving their geopolitical objectives at speed by leveraging abundant data, ubiquitous technology, and a connected world that obviates physical borders. So we have to do better to stay ahead of our adversaries. That's what acquisition agility is all about. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel members. We're working very hard to address these very issues. You have your full bios in your conference materials, but I want to say a little bit about their current roles and their previous background, just to highlight the precise aptness of them for this topic. Ms. Corin is the Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Strategy and Engagement and leads a team that positions the IC to achieve its future vision by leading transformative initiatives and cutting-edge R&D, supporting and spurring innovation, reimagining data management for the digital age, establishing clear policy and direction, and actively engaging with our overseers, the public and the Hill. Ms. Stone recently returned to ODNA from a JDA at the National Security Agency. She was executive director there, so she provided leadership in all areas across that enterprise, and was previously we may touch on legal, regulatory aspects. She was previously the IC Deputy General Counsel and Associate Deputy DNI for Policy Plans and Requirements. Next to her, Dr. Will Roper. Will's the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, AT&L, and serves, therefore, as the Air Force's Service Acquisition Executive. So he oversees Air Force R&D and acquisition activities totaling, an annual budget of $60 billion or more for more than 550 acquisition programs, and a workforce of more than, now the money catches your eye, 51,000 acquisition professionals. Prior to his current position, he was famously the founding director of the Pentagon Strategic Capabilities Office, or SCO, and previously was the acting chief architect at MDA, the Missile Defense Agency, where he developed 11 new systems, including the current European defense architecture, advanced drones, classified programs. I think you see the rationale for having Will here. Kevin Miners, Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Enterprise Capacity, responsible for all matters pertaining to IC resources, workforce, systems, technology, infrastructure. Kevin's previous, this is an edited list. Kevin's previous IC leadership positions include AD&I for Acquisition, Technology, and Facilities. He was Director of Advanced Technology within, I'm talking about things that are relevant for this discussion, Director of Advanced Technology within DARO, the Defense Airborne Reconnaissance Office, where he famously oversaw the development of our early UAV programs and the ISR ground component we all know and love as DCGS. He was director of ISR systems within the old ASD C3I, where he developed long-term acquisition strategies for overhead satellite programs. He was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence Strategies, Programs, and Resources, where he was in charge of long-term strategic planning and execution. So really in the past quarter century, if it involved MIP or NIP money, Kevin has led it, spent it, or killed it. So this really is the dream team, and Corin actually led the way in assembling this dream team. I want to thank you all for being here this morning. I thought we would start with a fundamental question. We won't do this each time, but I'm going to go down the road.
I got to ask just a protocol question. Since Corin and Will aren't wearing ties, can I take my tie off? I mean,
you should, brother.
So here's the story. You ready? So I was hanging out with Will Roper and Dr. Jason Matheny, if you guys remember him from IARPA.
He spoke yesterday, yeah.
And so they don't wear ties. And I was like, these guys are really cool. They're young and they're hip and they're smart. So I walked around the D&I like this. And so we're waiting to go in to see Stephanie O'Sullivan. And, you know, I don't know if you guys have been in the D&I, but you walk in Stephanie O'Sullivan's office to the right and Clapper's was to the left and Clapper's was to the right. And so Clapper walks out and he goes, Miners, what do you think it is? Casual day every day at the D&I? And I turned and I pointed to Jason and Will and I go, I just want to be like them, cool, young, and hip. And he just kind of looks, he goes back in his office and he comes back out and he looks at us all and he goes, you're none of those. But I try.
And now you know why I assembled them on my panel.
We could do this for the entire hour. It would be very entertaining. And we're gonna approach that value with the specific topic. So let's get to with the first question. We're gonna go down the row here. So it'll be not really an introductory statement, but a bit of level setting on a fundamental question. What does agility in acquisition mean to you? Do we have it, and why does that matter? Ms. Stone.
Do I need to? It's on. Okay.
It's on. Yep.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thanks for having us here today. To me, and I think, you'll see that this is such a great panel. Thank you guys for joining me. To me, acquisition agility really fundamentally comes down to speed and ease of getting capabilities into the community so that we can drive the mission. And, many of you may be aware about 2 years ago in the intelligence community, we went through a process to identify our top critical issues that we needed to solve as a community in order to continue to stay relevant and agile as a community. And all of the IIC elements agreed on 6 issues, one of which was acquisition agility. And so it is so fundamentally critical to what we do in the community, and I'll tell you why. Obviously, there's the threat environment that all of you are familiar with, you've heard about over the last day or so. There are a couple of lenses through which we think about this as well in the intelligence community that kind of amplify the threat environment. First is the fact that technology is widely available in ways that it never used to be. It is ubiquitous around the world, so where we used to have the advantage in the United States or in the US government, we don't so much anymore as far as access to technology. Rather, it's more about using it faster, and whoever gets to technology faster and can use it faster wins. And so we really have to focus less on the access and more on the ability to use it. That's the first lens. The second lens is the nature of our digital interconnectedness around the world, which obviates our physical borders and barriers in areas where we naturally have been used to them. So areas such as public and private sector distinctions, federal and state, or US and foreign countries. And all of that makes us much more intertwined. It affects the nature of competition, and it requires a lot tighter partnerships. And then the third lens through which we think about things in particular is the move from data scarcity to data overload. It used to be that we'd have to go around hunting and pecking for the data information we needed. We're now more in a place of data avalanche, and we need technology to help us sort through that data. And so from the intelligence community perspective, I would say those lenses intensify the need for us to be agile in our acquisition and in our ability to get capabilities in to the community at speed. Our adversaries are clearly taking advantage of those 3 lenses that I talked about. And so we need to not only keep pace with industry, we need to be able to take advantage of the collective intellect across our country to outpace our adversaries. And I think At the moment, we're on the precipice of not being there. I think we have done that for a long time, but I think the shift in where we are in our environment and the world today really necessitates a rethinking of how we do that and a shift in our thinking on risk and how we operate in today's environment. So in my ideal world, we wouldn't even have to think about acquisition. It would kind of be seamless and transparent because it would just deliver what we need when we need it in order to outpace the adversary. I think right now we do think about acquisition because it isn't quite where we need it to be. But to me, it all comes down to speed and the ease at which we can actually get capabilities in.
Louis, it's a good question. I've actually changed my answer just in the time that Corin's been speaking. So she gave me a lot of good things to think about, and it is a pleasure to share the panel with both of you. I was about to give you mechanisms to achieve agility, but you actually asked, what does it mean to me? And I guess if you have to boil it down to one thing, it's winning the time to market race. You can unpack that. It's actually quite a lot if you frame it that way. So time to market is not a term that we typically use in acquisition. In fact, time is not something that we appear to value if you look at what we track across programs. We track dollars. The heartbeat of an acquisition program is being able to say where your money's going, when it's going there. And so that sends the demand signal to the workforce that we really want you to know where every penny is. And if the whole focus is simply on trying to save money and do things efficiently, then we'll end up losing the time to market race with money in our pocket. So the most important thing we have to do in acquisition is to create a whole cultural ethos that's focused on time. Time to market isn't just your time, it's your adversaries' time too. You have to have a wherewithal of how quickly they're building things. You have to know what technologies are going to be break-aheads in either your own organization or coming from the commercial world. And you have to be able to get those into systems and deliver them, in my case to the warfighter, in your cases to the intelligence community, faster than that opponent. Because if you don't control that race, you might be ahead today, you might be dominant today, but just because the time constant is off between how quickly you can do something versus your opponent, you'll lose the chess game overall. So to me, it's really taking that view of winning the race, no matter whether it's a commercial technology, a defense technology, and pulling the aperture back to thinking of competing across all the landscape of technology that's being innovated in this country and around the world. Mechanism to achieve it, I'm pretty passionate about. There's an authorities issue, so you can't go achieve it if you don't have the authority to do it. The authorities tend to get a lot of the description, they get a lot of the coverage. So we're using a lot of authorities that Congress has granted us, Section 804 middle tier, but those are a mechanism. Those are not actually what make acquisition fast and agile. What does is culture. And that is another term that we're not great on in government. We love to talk about organization and process. Our industry counterparts, especially the tech industry, commercial tech industry, lives, eats, and breathes culture. Culture eats process for lunch. It really does. Because culture works for you all the time. It works in the exceptions to your process. And so the big focus for me is trying to create a culture where people feel empowered to use the authorities they've been given. Simple as that. And that is easier said than done. Because trying to convince people to take risk and charge ahead and do things differently, it means that they've got to be trained to do that, which we are, but they've also got to believe that when they come in with something that's different, that leadership is going to provide top cover for them. So you've got to live, eat, and breathe culture in everything you do as a leader, because it takes years to build up, is the experience I've had in the Air Force. I've been here a year and a half, and I'm amazed at how quickly in a large organization of 51,000 you can get a culture stood up. But I'm aware that I could kill it in a day with a few raw moves. You've got to live, eat, and breathe, being authentic to that culture. And the culture to me is going to be simply focused on time to market. I'm not going to make it the everything bagel of acquisition where I say go fast, save money, You don't hear that in the workforce. I received those memos when I was managing programs from leadership, and I didn't believe them. You've thrown the kitchen sink at me. You have to tell me clearly what is the primary value. And if we win the race to market, and we can do that over time, then I know that those disciplined aspects of acquisition, cost savings, risk management, I know they're happening because you can't run fast over time without them. But the message from me for our Air Force culture is that the clock is the most important thing. And if we lose that race, We won't be dead in the water today, or I guess dead in the air for us, but we will eventually because we're simply sliding down the slope.
So remember the old slogan from Ford Motor Company? It was like, quality is job one. So what we press at our quarterly program reviews with all of our IC program managers is basically job one for us. It's sort of along the same lines of what you were mentioning, is deliver at mission speed. And I have to tell you, that slogan, that line actually came from one of your questions. It was, I forget what venue I was at, but someone, one of the questions they raised was, how come folks in the IC can't deliver at mission speed? Which gets exactly to what your point was. And so from an OD&I perspective, mechanisms, or the three things I think of that I try and help our folks with is the 3 Ps. So it's process, it's policies, and people. So from the process perspective, when I first got to the D&I 5 years ago, I would watch a poor PM from the IC. They would go brief the J2, the J8, the SRA, the CAPE, the APNF, the ATNL. And it was crazy in terms of, they spent more time briefing oversight than they did briefing or actually working their programs. Yep. And so one of the things that we've tried to do as far as oversight in the process goes is do a quarterly program review where we bring everybody together at the same time so that program manager can brief everybody at one time and not have to do it like 12 times. So the second part is policies. So I think Tina had mentioned it in the briefing this morning. I grew up in the ACTD realm. I loved the ACT Breakfast Club. It was the idea of being able to do advanced concepts and advanced technology and try and bring things together. I was there when we started, the Global Hawks and the Predators and all those things as ACTDs. So, God bless Dawn Meyrick's, right before she left OD&I, she liked ACTDs as well. She created this ERD, Experimental Research Development Program, which is a policy that Corin shop approved, which allows the PMs to do much more sort of, in a 2 or 3 year cycle, deliver things and basically deliver at mission speed. So I think we've all heard Senator Warner in the old days basically say, why is, let's say, the NRO delivering a tethered cow in space? I mean, that was one of his favorite lines. And so now Dr. Troy Mink and his program manager, Daryl, have basically, we've granted them that policy of ERD, and they are now delivering from start to finish, launching into space satellites within 2.5 years. So again, delivering at mission speed. And then the last piece is people, as you said, the culture part. I think everybody in this room, I was trained by Dr. Mike Vickers, where he always talks in bookends. But we've seen program managers, we've seen contracting officers that are very conservative. And then you see program managers and contracting officers that are very, on the edge and pushing the envelope. And there's a whole bunch of folks in between. And if we could get to that culture piece where we make people feel like they're empowered to make decisions and to press that edge and to be a little less conservative, that is a really hard nut to crack. But I would tell you that's probably the underpinning of everything that we're trying to do is that culture piece.
Different takes. 3 different takes and very interesting. So let's turn that initial framing on its head. The title, Tortoise and the Hare, in the fable, the hare lost out to the tortoise because of the inherent wisdom of slow and steady wins the race. Speaking as the powerful tortoises, what's actually working? You sort of teased at a little bit, Kevin, Will, Corin, the efforts that you're beginning to make on this. In the current acquisition landscape, what do we not need to throw out? What should be respected and preserved?
Starting with me?
Let's start with Will this time.
I'll try to, and you can change your answer.
Right. Quick.
Hopefully I'll say something interesting.
Well, to make it specific, so you went from a small, lean, agile startup environment at SCO where you made your own rules, you took advantage, you mentioned authorities, you took advantage of little used authorities at SCO. You then walk into the world's largest bureaucracy in DoD, and we know what you've begun doing differently. What's preservable? What's working well?
The thing that's been a good learning experience for me, Lewis, is that most of the things that work at a small level work at a larger level for doing reform. It just takes longer. You've got more layers to get through. So the thing that I was very passionate about in SCO was prototyping as the primary way to do acquisition. To actually fly before we buy, that's such a common phrase that we do so seldomly. And I think it's because you pay a little more to fly before you buy. So it's tempting to go buy when you've kind of flown. And cautionary tales in acquisitions say that's not a good strategy on the whole. You should run your portfolio by the original Packard principles where you do fly before you buy. So it's been interesting pushing that into the Air Force, doing the same thing that we did at SCO, holding the prototyping temporally constrained. Super important that this is something you can easily say you're prototyping, but get the religion wrong. The second that the time is not constrained, you've got a program that is not trading performance to win that time to market. You want the first thing they do when they hit technical issues is to try to see, is there an 80 or 90% solution that still delivers on time? Well, you can apply that acquisition approach to anything, and we are. By simply using the rapid authorities and prototyping systems, the Air Force has removed over 100 years from its portfolio. Like, bending metal early is great, right? That's where real learning occurs. And so I've been excited to see that. It applies to most programs, and I think in the tortoise and hare analogy, there probably are a few programs that should be run the tortoise way, the wise tortoise going slow, getting all of the details done on a highly integrated, complicated weapon system with multiple concurrent risks that have to be dealt with simultaneously. But those programs are few and far between. So what we don't need in Air Force acquisition is more tortoises. We need a lot more smart hares. And it's a myth that you can't go fast and be rigorous. We have taken away none of the responsibilities to document and baseline programs that are going fast. What we do is we give that program manager the license to tailor how they document and when for maximum success of their program. And it's crazy, in reading my bio, it's crazy that the bio says overseeing $60 billion in acquisition programs. The idea that a person can do that actually speaks to the hubris that's baked in our system. I'm not overseeing $60 billion worth of acquisition content, even though on paper that's the job. It's the program managers that are doing it. So trust them, empower them, give them the ability to tailor what they're doing to the needs of what they're buying, and all of a sudden you're creating fast hares.
Me?
It's tough following Will. I'm giving it to you.
I know. Two pieces. One, I've learned from Kevin and Will over the last year-ish, as I've become a little more conversant in acquisition agility. As you said, that's not my background, so I am a lawyer, and as I've learned from them, the laws aren't really the problems. The laws and the policy, everybody always likes to point to the law and policy as the problem, but it turns out they're actually quite lenient. I think the issue is that it's hard to take a risk in this area. It's big money we're talking about. There are big consequences, and people aren't encouraged to take risks in this area. So I think one thing that can be preserved to a large degree, maybe not every single piece, is the law and policy. The other piece that will betray my background is that I think what must be preserved, and you touched on this, is oversight. I'm not saying it has to be preserved in the way we do it today. It can absolutely be streamlined, and I think you guys have many examples of really doing that well. But we have to have some level, the right level of oversight and transparency with our overseers, because if we don't, and we don't have that accountability, we know we will lose these authorities, as we have seen happen in the past. So I think whatever we do, whatever new system we come up with, we have to make sure that there is whatever the right level of oversight and transparency there for our overseers, for ourselves, to make sure that we're spending taxpayer dollars appropriately. And that is something that I know that we can and do all the time, but it's really easy to kind of sit back in our comfort area where we know we're okay, and to work in that space. And what we're asking people to do is push out of their comfort zones and make sure that we stay within the left and right boundaries, but push a little bit harder to where we need to be in the speed realm. And so I think that oversight piece, people will hear that and say, oh, she doesn't want to change any of the oversight process. Not at all. I think there's lots we can and should do to streamline it, make it better, easier, faster, trust our PMs, but we can't lose the fact that we have to have oversight and accountability.
Hey, Lewis, let me share one anecdote, which has been what I've seen across the board in the Air Force. So I was up at our Kessel Run pitch event a few weeks ago. So that's our software factory. They were doing a tech startup event where we put small businesses, tech startups on contract in a single day. So I was there, and then afterwards I wanted to talk with the team that put it on, and there was a lieutenant who came up to me, and she was ready to have this discussion with me about how she wants to innovate, but she can't get through the frozen middle that's impeding her. I mean, she was having an Oscar-winning moment. And I stopped her and said, you don't have to worry about that. I'm going to approve your program. You bring it to me tomorrow, and I'm going to give you your signature. And the wheels started turning, like when she realized, oh my goodness, Will's really going to approve this for me. And she said, well, wait a second, I've got a few things I'd like to check first. And so I'm going to schedule her in a few weeks to come down. But just in that conversation, the accountability that was put on her because of the empowerment and responsibility, those checks and double checks that she's doing, she's not doing them because they're mandated by some generic policy or process. She's doing them because she knows she needs to go fast over time. And so it's a complete myth that when you delegate and you empower people and you say go fast, that rigor goes out the door. In fact, I've actually seen it go up more in my career because now it's your rigor, it's your process, it's your accountability, not the thing that's being mandated by the generic monster in headquarters. So that's a myth we're going to have to dispel if we're going to actually do acquisition fast and agilely, is that you can't be fast without discipline. I've found in my experience you actually get both if the person you're empowering is truly empowered and believes in the top cover they're given.
So along those lines, when I heard this title, I thought back to Sue Gordon, who I used to work for. She used to say this line all the time, which you just sort of cemented, which was, and I think it's an old JSOC, SOCOM kind of special forces slogan, but it's slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And again, it gets to exactly to your point, what you were just saying. So Louis, just to answer your specific question, what seems to work? Young Zach Jett, who was our JDA, kind of went out and polled folks. It was overwhelming how many folks really like the BAA process. So IARPA has been using it for a long time. I think one of the things they like about BAAs is the dialogue continues. A lot of times when we get into the RFP process, when, the proposal hits and all of a sudden everybody stops talking, and you get to best and finals and stuff. But through that BAA process, the dialogue continues. The other thing they liked about BAAs is you can, especially when IARPA unclassified stuff, was you could bring in university and college kids that just had a lot of energy and a lot of innovation. They're just tons of it. So, for instance, I'll give you the shout out to the folks from DIA. We gave them an ERD to go look at how to upgrade MIDB, the MI database. So it's called Mars, and so what they've done, they went and actually talked to the IARPA guys. They talked to a bunch of different folks about how do you do the BAA process, and so they've actually issued 11 different BAAs to look at different, again, kind of advanced concepts, advanced technologies that could help them as they transform MIDB into Mars of the future. And even Tina Harrington this morning at that space talk talked about how she was AS&T. Within NRO has been the folks that do the most BAAs, but she said now, the GeoInts, the SIGINT folks, they're starting to do BAAs as well. So it seems to work.
It's good. All right. I think we've convinced the audience. Therefore, all right, and you've mentioned some specific tools that you have or are innovating and using, pitch days. What obstacles have you faced along the way? Let me tease that with an audience question, and we'll start with Will this time since it's addressed to him. You mentioned the myth of operating fast without discipline. You talked about winning time to market in addition to authorities and culture. Could you talk about AFWorks in those terms? Now, here's the consequence of transparency. And also explain why the AFWorks MDO demonstration was delayed from 10 to 12 September to late November.
So, big picture, right? If we're going to win time to market, we're going to have to win it primarily with commercial technology because that's what most technology is now. So that's the big change between the competition we're in now versus the Cold War, is that everyone can do technology. It's cheap to generate. So it's a big emphasis for me to make sure the Air Force can work with innovators anywhere. And primarily, they're going to be commercial innovators with commercial ambitions. And so initiatives like AFWorks, which is a front door for us to those organizations, they're doing great work with our Small Business Innovative Research Fund. I hate that term, by the way. I think it sounds pejorative. I mean, these are venture efforts. They're strategically important. But they're breaking down the barriers, so you don't have to be an expert in Air Force to work with us. And the pitch events are a mechanism to try to make the barrier and hurdle of getting on contract go away. So for a scale-up company, you can wait a month or 2 months to get a payment from us, but for a startup, that may not be the case. And to Corin's point, we're not limited by authorities. The FAR gives you amazing flexibility if you're willing to use it. You have to use the exceptions, not the rules. If you follow all the rules, it's like trying to push a wet noodle. I mean, it's not going to go fast and it's not going to go straight. So you have to use the exceptions. You have to encourage your people to use the exceptions. So AFWorks is doing a great job. We've got a completely different small business innovative research process we'll do in fiscal year 20. We're going to have money that goes out to the program offices and the research lab, but we're keeping a pot of it, about 40%, that we're calling the AF Ventures pot for corporate, big Air Force level small business innovative research. And AFWorks is going to help facilitate that for us. On the MDO delay, I'm not tracking the specific details of them. I haven't had a briefing with them on that, so I'm sorry I can't speak to that. But I'll take it as an action to get smart. But in general, what I think AFWorks has done a great job on is that when a company gets on contract with us, that's a tech startup or a commercial company, we don't treat them like a defense prime. We don't treat them like they know the ins and outs of governments. We mentor them and manage them as a cohort of companies hoping to find their business case within the defense market. And more importantly, in a way that does not put them on a trajectory to becoming a defense company per se. We want them to be a dual-use company that sees an advantage in our market, which is sizable at $700 billion in the department, which gives them an advantage to then go be a powerhouse commercially. We don't crack that code and people don't think it's no-brainer to work with the Air Force, so I'm going to go do it early on because they're not going to take any equity in my company. And look at all the companies they've helped grow and become successful. If we can't crack that nut and be successful there, then we're not going to be working with the full innovation base that exists in this nation. And it's hard to imagine winning a long-term competition if we're not.
I would just tell you, what I've noticed with a lot of PMs, especially PMs that have like really software-intensive acquisitions, there's not a policy that we have in place that helps them. So I would tell you that's a tool that I think we're going to be working with Corin Shop. I know Ellen Lord just put out a new policy directive that looks at how do you oversee and manage as a PM software-intensive programs. And I'll give you an example. So, and these aren't the right words, so don't quote this out of Kevin Miner saying, "Oh my God, they do level of effort work." But let's just say, for instance, an NSA program does $100 million a year developing things. And they get to a certain point and they snap the chalk line and they deliver that capability, speed of mission. Next year they got another $100 million and they deliver as much as they can. So Frank Kindle and I, as the MSA, because you're over that MSA limit, you're $500 million, you have to set it up. And it was, the way the policy set up is you have to do milestone A, milestone B, milestone C. And if you're looking at it from that perspective of I'm delivering a capability every 12 months or every 9 months, it just didn't make sense. And so we tried to initialize sort of a milestone B1, B2, B3. And every time we tried to work within the parameters, our legal folks would say, nope, not legal. So I think one of the biggest tools I think we're going to start working on this coming year, because everything seems to be very software intensive, is we need some kind of a policy that helps PMs with that sort of software intensive acquisition.
So I would just add, kind of as a riff off of that, a couple of things. First of all, the budget process is not built for agility and innovation. So I think one challenge that we have to grapple with is how we navigate a process that by design is meant to require predictability and clear deliverables and rigid schedules. and figure out how to make that consistent with innovation and agility in what we're trying to do with our capabilities. We need to be able to retain some measure of flexibility if we're going to actually be more agile in our acquisition. And yet, we recognize that the budget requires certain things and waits for no one, and also doesn't approve things that aren't clear and accountable and all the rest. And so we have to figure out how to navigate that. I don't know what that looks like at the moment, but I think that's an area where we're definitely going to have some challenges, and we need to engage not only kind of with OMB, but with Congress to understand how they want us to sort of navigate those pieces. I also want to foot stomp something that Will said earlier on the culture piece. I think one of the huge challenges here really is mostly cultural, and that is because we are asking people to really test some long-established assumptions, risk calculus, and methods for acquiring technology. And we've got a workforce that is really skilled and dedicated and well-versed in the current way of doing business. And I'm not sure they've been encouraged to be creative and innovative in the past because there are ramifications. And so we need to work both with the workforce and with the leaders and the overseers to make sure they're doing like Will does here and exemplifying the behavior that we think we want to see in that workforce so that they're willing to take those risks. And I think you cannot understate how important it is to have these conversations both bottom up and really top down so people can see from their leadership. They've got the top cover, they've got the backing, they are being not only asked but required to be forward leaning and recognizing kind of the end state we're trying to get to, and I think that culture piece is still a huge hurdle. So I think between the budget process and the culture, we're going to have some big challenges going forward.
I'm struck by that discussion and Kevin's comment on software. I would be remiss, I think Bob Gorley's in the audience here somewhere, if I didn't quote Mark Andreessen, founder of Netscape, who famously said 20 years ago, software eats the world. Everything's becoming software, virtualizing everything. So I think that's a salutary move that the IC is going to be making. And it makes me think, based on what Corin was saying, so Corin, you been in OD&I, you then went to an agency, and it's a DoD component agency, NSA. So you saw the world through that lens, looking then at the center and having two masters to think about, two acquisition frameworks and mindsets. So for each of you, because you have a particular, Kevin, you've been on both sides of the fence, and Will, you've been in all elements of DoD, all size and scale. What of the others, regulatory frameworks, acquisition mindsets, do you see as valuable, and are there ways that, particularly on something as big as software, where the IC and DoD can learn from each other, can adopt best practices, and actually do things in a joint environment on acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing the same mindset. That's partially why we're here together, that Will has certainly been leading the way, and I think Kevin right there with him, and we see this back and forth where we're trying to learn from each other on that, certainly the software focus and understanding a model that is, rather than kind of developing for a develop with kind of engagement with industry partners. There are some differences. You guys can get into the details of that. A lot of similarities. I think what's really critical from my perspective, and having been in that position, seeing the DoD element in the IC, is that we have to make sure that the frameworks are harmonious. They don't have to be identical, and I think there's a lot of value to making sure that we're leveraging the unique authorities that each one has. But if they're inconsistent, it ties our IC agencies in knots and our DoD agencies in knots, frankly. So many of our people are in both the IC and DoD. Half of the IC is DoD as well. We have a lot of joint acquisitions, a lot of jointly funded things. So if we aren't compatible and leveraging the best of both worlds, then we not only aren't doing the best we can for the nation, but we're not able, in many instances, to even get anything done. And so I think what I saw a lot of was trying to figure out how to leverage the system so that we could get the benefits of being in both worlds. But at the same time, there are always areas where there may be inconsistencies, and I think that just ties everyone in knots. So it's really important to have that optic and to be doing this together, which is exactly why we're having these conversations together and trying to leverage the lessons learned that each other has and understand what the best practices are and go forward. Not so that we can just have one system, because I don't think that's beneficial. I think we do have differences for a reason, and we have slightly different but obviously overlapping missions. But we have to be consistent so that we can navigate these together, because we do so much together.
I do want to highlight, the reason we are here is that we have lots of discussions together. So I've said, even if no one comes to this panel, it'll be fun just to sit around and chat with both Kevin and Corin. So collaboration's key. No one owns the trademark on innovation. There's always something to learn. Software's been the big surprise for me in Air Force. I got asked a lot of questions about software reform going through confirmation, and I remember thinking, this is going to be hard, because the government's not good at software. And I've been delighted at how easy it's been getting large teams of coders up and running. Sometimes they're all Air Force coders, sometimes it's a mix of Air Force and industry, but doing agile software development, or DevSecOps in current parlance, that's been a lot easier than I thought. We've made it cool to do software, and so now, I've gone from thinking it's going to be hard to get people who can write good code in the Air Force to having thousands of coders writing code today that'll go deliver capability in weeks, not months or years. So I've been delighted at that. The thing I'm trying to win the argument on, and Kevin pulled up the point, is we can't hide the fact that software is different. It is not a product. The more we try to cram it into a product-oriented acquisition, the less it's going to fit and the dumber it's going to look. Right? There are no milestone A, Bs, and Cs. Right? We're buying software level of effort. We shouldn't hide that. It is level of effort. And you manage it based on metrics and user feedback. But it's not the only thing we do that way, right? That's a service contract. You buy a level of effort, you have metrics to measure whether or not you're getting a quality service, and if your user isn't happy, you failed. We do $150 billion of service contracts in the department. We have a good process for managing services. We just need to think of software that way. It's not a product anymore. You are buying a service called coding talent. And it is up to the program manager to make sure that that coding talent is delivering what the operator needs, and that they have metrics to ensure that we're getting quality within the government. So my hope over this next year is to do a couple of things, is to standardize those metrics. I'm still going to let programs tailor them, because I think that there will be some nuances, but on the whole, velocity, quality, things of this nature, backlog management will matter, and we should look at them across the Air Force. I hope that that will help us with Congress, where we can say, let me talk to you about the quality of coding, right? The deficiency retirement of coding, the velocity of coding across the Air Force. I think that will help. Thing two is we've got to get our program teams out of the business of having to be platform and infrastructure experts to eventually be software experts, to be app experts. So every team individually has to get their infrastructure and platform stood up. We want to pull that centrally. So we're going to move our factories this year into our Air Force Cloud, Cloud One, and then provide coding platforms as a service to any program who wants them that are pre-accredited and approved. So in future, I hope that when a program says, I want to be a cool software program, that they don't have to go out and pick a cloud and pick a platform. They get a virtual private cloud, and they get to log on day one, code on day one, and deliver faster for the warfighter. So I've been delighted with that. I'm trying to share the things that we've learned, because we learned, Louis. The thing, we've got so much to learn about software, but we had to have companies walk us through, sit down beside us, and walk us through how to do this so that we could train ourselves across the Air Force. So we are trying to make that available broadly, because we had to be taught it. You asked what can we learn from other organizations? The thing I see in the intelligence community, and I've had tremendous collaboration with the intelligence community through my whole career, is that the things that really shine in the IC, there's a lot of delegation of responsibility and authority. So organizations that have done that well have tended to move faster than those that haven't. And so that's something I'm happy we're finally bringing into the Air Force, where delegation does not mean a lack of importance in the delegator. It means the delegator has to have a different role in managing the organization, create tools instead of rules that empower people to do things smart. Then it goes back to put people in charge, trust them. If you can't, you've already lost.
So I like that we can share and look back and forth. So, for instance, that ACTD kind of paradigm that the department was using, we're doing that now with the ERDs. I'll tell you one of the big things that Will and I experienced quite a bit was and for the folks that don't understand how the budget process works in the Pentagon, as you roll up the budget towards the end, after the services submit their POMs to OSD and the Joint Staff and to the COCOMs, look at all the train and equip dollars, is we come in with issue papers and we go through the 3-star programmers and then to the what used to be called the DMAG, the Deputies Management Action Group. And so I always felt like it was a good way. It was very transparent. You got the COCOMs involved in terms of being able to describe what it was we were trying to do with the budget, in terms of moving dollars from this program to that program, or did we want to buy a U2 or a Global Hawk, whatever it was. You got to make your case in front of all of the 3 stars that were in each one of the service planning and programming shops, as well as you brought it to the chair of the DMAG was the vice chairman and deputy secretary. And so that process, if I was to ask Will offline, what'd you think of that process? He did very well in that process, by the way. You took your budget from like $100 million to almost like $2 billion because you repurposed things that were already available and then gave it to the COCOMs in the time when they were still there, which was, they talk about innovation. But that process, we tried to lift clean and not perfectly, lift clean in place and put it over into the D&I, but we've created our own sort of 3-star programmers. We call it the engine room because Clapper was always, I'm in the engine room shoveling coal. So that's where the CAPE and our CFO folks come together with all of our NIMs and mission managers to talk about where are the holes. And then we basically have a consolidated resource investment board. Unfortunately, it's spelled CRIB. Some people think that's where you go to cry to get money. But that process that I saw working fairly well over in the Pentagon in terms of transparency, there was a lot of warts. There was a lot of folks that complained. There was too many meetings. But from a transparency perspective, I think everybody understood what were the facts on the table, what were you trying to do, and then you could make decisions. So we tried to take that process and not mirror it, but kind of use that same transparency philosophy, which was, let's get the worker bees at the our SRA is CAPE. So SRA and CFO together, they're running the engine room. They bring issues to the crib, and so we have our 4 deputy directors. So Corin and we all sit at one side, and then we have the NCTC, NCPC, NCSC. They all sit on the other side, and we basically bring forward kind of decision quality data into the Dexcom so they can make decisions about. And as an example, last year, Sue Gordon, a PDD, and I said, I'm going to withhold 0.75% of the budget, and I want to focus it in on AI machine learning. And so we use that engine room crib, working with all the agencies to say, hey, come in with your biggest and best ideas. Here's a pot of money, and we were able to go through and allocate that then through the Dexcom to the different individuals. So I like having, seeing what these guys are doing, and they can see what we're doing, and we learn from each other.
I had blogged recently about the Oxcart program, when they declassified Kelly Johnson's own internal history of the A12 program. So he wrote it in 1968, so a decade after the first idea, but if you look at the history of it as he spelled it out, the idea was 1958. The contract was let in 1960. The first test flight was in 62, and operational flights by 64. So really within one POM cycle, essentially, you went from brainstorm to the A12, which was an unbelievable plane. So in that kind of time frame, what it really says to me, though, is now there was no transparency with that program. Times were different, but he was able to run a massively dispersed engineering project with no Excel spreadsheets and nothing but telephones and paper, but achieve advantage. So Corin started off in her first response talking about advantage as being a goal. And I know that's a DOD goal. It was a SCO goal. It's a DOD Air Force goal. Advantage. How do we ensure, given everything you've described, all the efforts together towards rapidity and transparency and agility, how do you ensure that the end result is, if it's time, how do you define marketplace? If it's time to market as your metric, as your goal, how do you achieve ensure advantage against all adversaries? Let's start with Will.
I think, as I tried to mention in the opening, that there's nuance in approaching the idea of time to market being the thing to win. There's an understanding of the market. That means you need to understand technology, the full landscape of it. You need to understand your capabilities and limitations. You need to understand your adversaries. It truly is the net assessment of what you should focus on. And there's no magic 8-ball that you can shake that will tell you what that is. There's no way to just create a formulaic approach to calculate it. It really comes through strategic thinking, forecasting in some cases, hedging against risk you can't accept. So it truly is the net assessment of what you should be focusing on. But even though that net assessment is complicated and something we should be struggling with across the DoD and the intelligence community, what it should tell us to do in acquisition is simple. It should tell us to go fast. So whatever is decided to be the thing we have to win the race to market on, whether it's AI, quantum, or any of the other buzzwords that are brought up, that we don't know when, where, how they're going to hit their next echelon, but when they do, we want our warfighters to have them first. That has to be done no matter what it is. And so I come back to, if the technologies that are going to change the future are going to be commercial in nature, then we're not going to win that time to market if we're not already working with the innovators creating them. That means turning ourselves inside out and learning how to do tech maturation with commercial partners. Thing two, if we can't find a way to accept good enough solutions now versus perfect solutions later by the formal requirements process, then those that are able to do that will have, their warfighters have an advantage, right? The 80% solution of a leap ahead is still a leap ahead. And we find it so easy to get in the way of that common sense approach. So we've got to have the way to basically release the safety valve so that you can stay on time and not go chasing the few percentile of performance gains. And finally, we have to have tight relationships with our warfighters. Our warfighters in the Air Force are bigger fans of rapid acquisition than even me, because they face the threats. They are the biggest supporters. They make people available to coach us, guide us. But when you go fast, you've got to go fast with your warfighter. You have to understand their challenges, needs. You've got to understand how they're going to train, equip. And so what we've really done is just get rid of the big requirements documents, which are really, they're not of much value before you have industry on contract, and replace them with short descriptions of the strategic need and what's valued. What are the metrics that will be valued if they're greater rather than less? And then to continue iterating with the warfighter. So we talk the OODA loop in the Air Force, like John Boyd, observe, orient, decide, act. If you can do that faster than your opponent, you win. It's time to finally take that common sense idea into acquisition. Say, if we can't shrink our OODA loop, then we'll lose the competition, even if we're ready to win the war today.
So I would just kind of spin that a little bit towards the IC and say that, again, this is an area where, we're achieving flattery by imitating a little bit of DoD. So in the most recent transformation at the ODNI, we're actually standing up a net assessment function for that exact reason. DoD has had a net assessment function for many, many years now that looks at, military advantage, and we don't have an intelligence advantage equivalent. And so we're starting that same kind of process to think about what is our intelligence adversary going to look like in 5 to 10 years, and where do we need to be? And I think, again, to your point, Will, and from my earlier remarks, I don't think acquisition necessarily there has an end state to advantage. In my mind, if we don't think about it, now people who do it are thinking about it, but from the end state perspective, acquisition should be somewhat transparent. We should just have the capabilities we need when we need them. In order to do that, you need all of these other things and all of these other processes in place, and you need to have the risk calculus, and you need to have that research done with the private sector and industry and all the rest. But in an ideal world, the capabilities are there when you need them in order to get that advantage. And so I think that's where we want to be, and that's what we're trying to learn as well from DoD in that sense.
Louis, I will say, I want to give Corin and her team a shout out. They have a hard thing to do in the IC because the acquisition authority is distributed. So we get the benefit in the services of having some centralization and being able to standardize things. So Corin and her team, working with Kevin, are having to work really hard. And I see the enthusiasm, the right ideas, but I just wanted to acknowledge that they've got a tougher challenge in many respects.
Well, so 30-second answer on this. I mean, across the DoD, acquisition authority is very distributed. So what's your comparative assessment of the other services to Air Force on what you're doing?
Let's see. Colin's getting his recorder out, ready to go. So the one thing I can say on that, and I truly believe this because I got to help every service in scope. I mean, we were there. We did it. Its acquisition is different in each service. There's some commonalities that are shared. We all want to be urgent and go fast, but shipbuilding is very different than anything we do in the Air Force, and the number of soldiers that have to be equipped is very different because of just the scale. The Air Force has a lot of high-tech stuff. We have a very tech-driven portfolio. So I've heard said, I can't remember who said it, that the Army puts technology in the hands of people, the Air Force puts people behind technology, meaning that the technology is what guides us. So there are differences for all of us. I think the thing that we all are sharing, and I've seen a big change in the Air Force and I'm seeing it in other services, is just believing that we're in a long-term competition. Now that sounds like, it's motherhood and apple pie, but believing you're in a competition actually starts that culture change that you need. You've got to feel urgent on it. So I think all the services share that. The mechanisms that we're using to employ it are different. So I can't really, I don't want to give a progress report on anyone. I've got a big enough job trying to make the Air Force as agile as it can be, but we're not even close to being done. We've proved we can run a good first lap and we can do things differently. We got a long race ahead. We cannot rest on our laurels. We cannot be happy with time we've taken out of programs or software factories we've stood up or pitch events we've done, even though there are a lot of good talking points for a venue like this. Are we as competitive as we need to be? No, we're not. And we can never be satisfied with where we are. So that comes from believing that you've got a threat and that if you're not innovating today, if you're not urgent today, maybe your adversary is.
Some of the last few questions have been audience questions. We have a high volume of audience questions that reflect there are many startup or small company representatives in the room, and they are asking what you might expect, and we've touched on some of this, and you've also touched on some of the industry engagement efforts that you're leading, and the innovative ways you're trying to do it, and so forth. But let me turn around and ask it it's really the same question. You've each touched on the culture within the government acquisition community. We talked about the tens of thousands that you have across the IC. It's probably of very large scale. And let me blend two quick questions together and think about this. The real question is about your acquisition workforce, meeting with people like this or serving their needs. One was interesting. How do you ensure that the companies that attend, for example, an Air Force pitch day and that get those contracts and cyber contracts are legitimate, secure, and can deliver? And what about this is the real question, what about those that are simply spin-offs of major defense contractors and may not have the mindset or speed you want? Might take that as a sign of goodness, right, that the elephants are learning to dance. But you've mentioned that much of the relevant terminology is commercially sourced. Is the government somewhat disadvantaged by its leading workforce who, while quite distinguished, this is kind of anonymous, blunt question you get, right? That its acquisition leaders, while quite distinguished, are career government employees with no commercial or tech experience. So as you think about the workforce that you're trying to move in the directions you've pointed out today, what are the steps you're taking to shift their mindsets as well to be responsive?
So I see one of my mentors, Tish Long, out there. I'll call out another mentor. It was Art Money. So I was a baby SES, and I'm sitting there with Art Money, and he's doing his first mentoring session. And he looks at me and he goes, "Hey, so what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I have no clue, right? I have not thought through this at all. And so your immediate answer is, I want to be you. I want to be you one day, ASDC3I. And he goes, you can't be me. I said, why not? He goes, you've never done industry time. He says, when you sit down with industry, you look at those folks, they are looking at you like you have no clue. You've been a government program manager your whole life. You don't understand what a profit loss center is. You don't understand what the goals are. And I got to tell you, that has been there my entire career, and I spend an inordinate amount of time sitting down with every single industry person to make sure I've never been in their shoes. I don't have to make a profit for a corporation or stockholders. But I got to tell you, I think meeting one-on-one with each, whether, I'm not going to call it every company we meet with, but there's a lot of them, you do get sort of that feeling of what they're going through and why is it so hard to break through in that technology or through this agency, or, hey, I'm blackballed over here, I'm doing pretty good over here, not here. So yeah, I would take that criticism. I've never been a corporate person. Hopefully one day I will be. But
when you grow up.
But yeah, no, that's a good criticism.
From my point of view, it's been really helpful coming into government, being a recovering mathematician, right? Yeah. I've been asked before, did studying string theory for all those years, is it any benefit to you now? And the only thing I can say is that string theory problems are a little harder to solve than government problems. Everything in front of us is solvable. And if you're trying to balance the equation of how to make acquisition reform work, you have to make it work for industry. We don't build anything in government, or very little. So I've been trying to help the Air Force understand that the whole model we have for working with industry makes zero sense for someone like me coming in. Right now, our programs are so few and far between that we ask industry indirectly to lose money designing things. We ask them to buy in, that they'll make money back in the large production runs and long-term sustainment contracts we've grown accustomed to. If you're trying to have a cutting-edge Air Force, having industry lose money in design is about the dumbest idea you could put on the table. If you want to go back to the Oshkosh days, you want companies to envision themselves as cutting-edge designers and there to be profit in it, there to be a business case in it. So we've got to break ourselves out of this major defense acquisition program rut we're in. Right, we're killing our industry base. We are not getting design as esteemed as it should be. So that's on the government's point of view. We have to change our model and not congratulate ourselves when we see savings at contract award, when we know full well that those savings are going to be paid back and how long we're going to be stuck with those programs and have them be sustained without the ability to be agile. So that comes from understanding industry's business case. So I put the onus on us that we need to change. In terms of how you do it with people in government, because in Air Force acquisition, a lot of our acquisition workforce is military, large civilian as well, but we have military folks. So they can't rotate in and out of industry. So we try to create mechanisms that do it in effect. So education with industry is a huge program in the Air Force. We've been doing it for 72 years. It allows people to go embed in organizations like Amazon or Delta, where there is something for us to learn. And when airmen are there, they're not in their uniform, they look like any other employee, and they're there to transition that knowledge. It has been hugely successful, but we need to expand it, and we need to do it more frequently. It's a one-time thing. It needs to be a continual thing. The other thing the Air Force does well, not anything I've done, I've inherited this, and I'm the beneficiary of it, is that you have to go get a higher education degree to be promoted in the Air Force. And the Air Force really focuses on acquisition that needs to be a technical degree. So I have a workforce, all the leadership almost all have like a master's in engineering or a science. And so that truly helps because in addition to getting your technical chops up, that's time outside the government as well where you can kind of re-immerse in what's current. But the thing that needs to change is that needs to be more frequent and continual. Continual lifelong learning with industry. And that way, even if you haven't been in industry, you can get the benefit of gleaning that knowledge.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And we actually, again, have modeled legislation after some of the authorities that DoD has to actually move public-private sector back and forth and have a talent exchange. We, in the IC, did not have that authority before. We now have it in a couple of the bills. And so that's a great step forward for us, but I think we absolutely see that same need to allow people to come in and out. I think in decades past, if you left the government, you're sort of dead to me. And now I think we take this position and we understand that, in fact, that is counterproductive for us because there's so much to learn outside the government and then to bring back to government. And so we're starting to really encourage that across the board in many different ways. And so we're looking at how to be smarter about the workforce generally and make sure that we can take advantage of the intellect that is happening all over this country, both by allowing our folks to go out and come back in and allowing folks who are out to come in temporarily, potentially, to work with us and then go back out. And so we're thinking through different mechanisms there. We also have a program called InStep that a lot of the industry partners have come in through to meet with folks in the IC. What we're doing right now is trying to get it to kind of 2.0 version. So it's not just coming in and chatting with people and hoping somebody will call you ultimately, but thinking through more what happens next and making sure that those connections are made cleanly and that folks really have the opportunity to get the products into the system if that's where they should be. And so we're looking at that right now, and we're talking a lot with industry now in the course of this initiative that we're doing to make sure we understand the issues that they face and where they think we need to be smarter, faster, more agile so that they can work with us better. Because to Will's point, if they can't engage with us, we lose because they're where all the technology is. And so, or most of the technology is. And so I think that we're very, very focused on making sure that we're having those engagements with industry and understanding the perspective from industry so that we can address those issues.
InStep's a great program. I've participated in it. You have some of the leadership sitting here in the room. And in that same theory, Will hired me at SCO as an unpaid special government employee. That my company, now admittedly, my day job, we're a large company, so we can afford to do that. So I think we have time for one more question. Thinking about large companies, we've talked a lot about startups. A lot of the questions were from startups, but this is an interesting question as well. DoD's innovation initiatives, I think the IC as well, sound almost entirely focused on small businesses. Large tech companies spend significantly on technology innovation. I think not just technology companies like the DIB companies, the large contractors, and can deliver scalable, certified technology. How can we get a seat at innovation events like pitch days? In that spirit, how do you make sure that we also leverage the American advantage of having, a mass deliverable in the defense large-scale community?
Sure.
So whoever asked the question, thank you for doing it. We would be remiss to discuss working with tech startups and commercial companies and pretend that we can build a stealth fighter or bomber with them. Now, I think you could argue that there might be a different kind of Air Force we could build with them in this century, and that might be pretty cool to explore. But we are in no way, shape, or form ready to abandon the Air Force concepts that have made us so dominant. And so we need to win the long-term competition with China and Russia. We need our defense primes, our defense industry base, to be thought of as leading innovators. And so we've got to do our part to make sure that innovation is something that we have proper incentives to reward. I just mentioned for the large programs, we ask you to lose money. We have to change that. The thing I would ask industry, the large industries who build platforms, and I am open to ideas on how to get there, so come see me, is I need industry to find a way to encourage third-party development on their systems. Now, the iPhone is often touted, where you have all the apps. It's a bad example for the DIB, right? There's no information to monetize if someone builds an iPhone where other people are writing apps on it. We're going to have to replace that some way, whether it's royalties or other mechanisms, and we're having discussions with companies now about how to do that. So there is an incentive to do it. And I would ask every company to really, really invest in the technologies I'm most excited about, which are design and production focused technologies like agile software we've mentioned, digital engineering we've mentioned, open architecture. If we can change the historical performance and cost schedule performance to be focused more on agility and upgradability, the only way we're going to do that and have the ability to continually innovate with platforms is if we bring in these technologies that allow you to upgrade things routinely and safely. And we're behind the times. So that's something I would like to see quickly cross the DIB. And then rather than have programs that are decades between, or modernization efforts that are decades between, we should be modernizing every year and have technologies that enable us to do that safely without going through the wickets that a new program would. So that's my request. If you have ideas on how we can make designing your system to be a platform for developers by an end-state product, I'm open.
Yeah, and I think from the IC perspective, again, we are always going to need the industrial base to do what they do. I mean, we talked about the differences between building a satellite and building software. We're always going to still need to build satellites. So can we be innovative in that process? Do we want those big industrial partners to think through with us how to do that smarter, easier, faster? Absolutely, but we're never not going to have a need for that kind of engagement as well. This is an and, not an or. And so we need to be having those conversations with all of the different kinds of parties that we have out there to make sure that we're just as smart as we can be in those different areas.
That's great. I wish we had several more hours with this great panel, and I know from the volume of questions from the audience that they wish that too. Let me leave the three of you with just kind of a capsule of some of the other questions that we couldn't get to, just thematically. There were several about how do you see overcoming security and CI issues as a roadblock to agility and acquisition. There were a couple of really interesting questions about what do you see as optimal ways for academia to continue partnering to facilitate innovation. I know you're each working on initiatives there. And another interesting one, are you satisfied for Corin and Kevin, are you satisfied with the IC's capabilities harnessing open source intelligence? What can be done to improve that? It's an area tailor-made for rapid acquisition. And I think that's true. I'll just sum up with a couple of things that I learned and was really happy to see, and I believe the audience. In addition to the IC's Acquisition Agility Initiative as one of your key pillars, that you're starting a net assessment function, because that was my first government job, was working for Andy Marshall back in the 80s in ONA, that each of you are really thoughtful about this trade-off on advantage and time to marketplace. And I hope, I saw several journalists here, I hope you'll write that, because I want to see that captured. And then third, that you are thinking really hard about this move to software across the future and what it means to both communities. So I know that everyone will want to join me in thanking our great panelists for a tremendous conversation.